Very much like to start the last panel and give the presenters the time that they need for a very important issue. You heard earlier Professor Bauer's remarks about that this is not only an academic function, but one that we hope will have some practical and, in a sense, political, and both in the larger C and smaller C. So I'd like to turn the over to Robert Williams from the United States, who will be moderating it, and ask everyone to please come in, sit down, and everyone who is doing so to prepare your live tweets as well.
Thank you, Mark. Before I begin, just a quick note, given the lavalier is a little hot. Given the pressure of time, I'm going to ask the panelists to try to keep to time as much as possible, and then I hope to turn it over to the audience for a brief question and answer session, in part because of the importance of this topic. Before we get there, though, I'm Dr. Robert Williams of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'm also on the U.S. delegation to IHRA, where I have been a longtime member of the Committee on Anti-Semitism, and I also chair IHRA's work on data protection and access to archives. The subject of our final panel, and I hate to disagree with my colleague Alex Moss, is the most important of the day in many ways. It's particular, it's ephemeral, but it has a lasting impact. It is political discourse, specifically political discourse as it uses or abuses Holocaust imagery. Like genocide, the term Holocaust means a number of things to a wide range of people. Primarily, it has historical value as a concept that references the intentional murder of approximately 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany, its allies, and local collaborators. The word Holocaust also carries with it a moral imperative to never forget, to take action against the causes of the Holocaust, as well as other forms of genocide, lest it happen again. Admittedly, we in the international community have fallen well short on these fronts, but we're not going to discuss that today. Some invoke the Holocaust in a manner that carries political weight. Occasionally, this intersects with the historical and the moral, but it often enough appears as an invocation to inspire some form of popular and elite political action. It seems that the misuse of Holocaust imagery is increasingly common to political discourse today, be it in presidential and parliamentary elections, in government condemnations about the uncomfortable truths espoused by scholars and public intellectuals, in rhetoric surrounding crises in the Middle East or crises in Eastern Europe, or through attempts to appropriate the status of historical victims for groups who suffered in ways different than did the Jews under Nazism. The examples are legion, and as I say these words, I'm sure each of us has in mind a particular politician inveighing against a particular policy in which she or he referenced the Holocaust. Despite this, it is important to note that there are those who try to employ the Holocaust in more responsible ways. Over the past year, politicians from various parts of the world have reaffirmed a commitment to remember the Holocaust, be it as a means to address contemporary human rights challenges, or simply to ensure that our collective memory of the civilizational break that was the Holocaust continues as a warning to all of us about our potential to succumb to brutality. I got into this field for a number of reasons, but one of them is best summed up by a quote that I walk by each day I go into my office in Washington. It's by President Bill Clinton. I'm going to paraphrase him briefly. This subject, the Holocaust, will touch the life of everyone who encounters it and leave everyone forever changed. The Holocaust creates deep sadness, but also a sanctuary of bright hope. It is an ally of education against ignorance, of humility against arrogance, an investment in a secure future against whatever insanity lurks ahead. If we can mobilize morality through Holocaust knowledge and employing it in a responsible manner, then those who have perished will gain a measure of immortality. And I think there's a certain truth to it. But there's also a certain truth in one of President Clinton's friends, Elie Wiesel, who has said many times over the past few years that overuse of the word Holocaust has become so rife that the word is losing, if not has already lost its meaning. These comments hint at the subject of our discussion today. How can we ensure that our leaders, be they in democratic societies or those who remain under the sway of various forms of authoritarianism, employ the Holocaust in a responsible manner, in a manner that will help us on our path to a better and more moral existence? Today's panelists are going to help us in our search. They are, and I'll just go in the order that they'll be speaking, Peter Kreko. Dr. Kreko is the director of the Political Capital Institute. It's a think tank based here in Budapest that is doing extensive research on anti-Semitism, political extremism, and political violence in Hungary and throughout Europe. Dr. Kreko is also an associate professor here at ELTE and a member of the EU Radicalization Awareness Network's Center of Excellence. It's a body that is doing consultancy work and research for the European Commission. He regularly serves as a commentator in leading international media and wrote his doctorate on the social psychology of conspiracy theories. Our second speaker is Rabbi Andrew Baker. Rabbi Baker is the Director of International Jewish Affairs for the American Jewish Committee. In 2009, he was appointed personal representative of the OSCE Chair-in-Office on combating anti-Semitism, and he continues to serve in this position. He is an officer of the Jewish Claims Conference and has served on restitution and historical commissions in the Czech Republic, Lithuania, Romania, and Slovakia. In recognition of his work in Europe, he has been decorated by the presidents of Germany, Lithuania, Latvia, and Romania. He's past president of the Interfaith Conference of Washington, a former commissioner of the District of Columbia Human Rights Commission, a past president of the Washington Board of Rabbis, and I think he was prepared for this by having served as a chaplain at San Quentin Prison. Our final speaker is Boriss Cilevics. Mr. Cilevics was educated in physics and began as a computer scientist. In the late 1980s, he took part in founding the first human rights group in Latvia. Later, he led a human rights NGO, participated in a number of international projects, and published dozens of research papers on non-discrimination and equality. In addition to that, he also wrote on minority rights and democracy in plural societies. In 1998, he became an elected member of the Latvian National Parliament and has been re-elected 5 times since then. He's vice chair of the Standing Committee on Human Rights and an active member of the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, having prepared more than 20 reports for them, and is a permanent assembly observer in the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. With all this work, he still manages to stay involved with civil society, regularly participates in NGO projects, in particular as both a trainer and a lecturer. With that, I think we should begin our discussion. Following their comments, I'll pose a few questions to the group and then open it to the floor for discussion. So, Dr. Kreko, if you could begin.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me to this extremely important event. At the very beginning, I will be a very unpolite panelist in the sense that I will partially talk about things that were originally not included in the agenda of this panel. At the very beginning, I would like to give a very brief overview of what we have found in our studies about Hungarian anti-Semitism, and we prepared an info video that gives a short picture on what we think the biggest problem here is Hungary. This is just a 4 minutes video, so if I know it well, we all received 10 minutes at the beginning to contribute, so I will eat up about half of it and then make some additional remarks. So this video is prepared by Technical Tech Foundation based on our researches on anti-Semitism. Thank you. So, as you could see in the video, I think what characterizes the Hungarian anti-Semitic public discourses is mainly the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which is not a unique Hungarian phenomenon. I want to clearly underline it. We have done some comparative research in Central Eastern Europe, and even France was included in one of our researches, and we could find similar high rates of conspiracy theorizing against the Jews. I think when it comes to Holocaust denial, Holocaust relativization, it always appears, of course, in the anti-Semitic public discourses, but this is not something that always dominates the public discourses. Generally, about 1/3 of the Hungarian society is receptive to conspiracy theories regarding the Jews. Even there is a group who doesn't say, for example, that they dislike the Jews, but they say that the Jews have too much power in the financial world, the Jews have secret plans to dominate the world, and so on and so on. And then they can say that this is not a prejudice, this is just a fact. So this is, I think, a more dangerous form of anti-Semitism. And according to Polish researchers, this is really dangerous in the sense that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories lead to potentially violent actions or even to discrimination with a higher likelihood than the more visceral, emotional forms of anti-Semitism. Generally, what we also have to say, and it's pretty important, that in Hungary, and I think in overall Central Eastern Europe, maybe previous speakers thought about it as well, the words are more horrible than the acts, in the sense that fortunately the Hungarian Jewish community doesn't face the same kind of threats that we can see in Western Europe nowadays, in Paris, for example, or Belgium, or elsewhere. So while the language, even sometimes the language in the mainstream political discourse, I mean, even in the parliament, is really frightening, but I would rather say that in Hungary, the Jews are rather served as a symbolic or invisible enemy for many, which means that the problem with them is, as it appears in the discourse, is that they are invisible and invisibly guiding the phenomenon. So fortunately, this is, I think, more ideological in their nature than an ideology, than something, an attitude that leads to action. But there's a problem with the conspiracy theories, and this is that they proliferate in the times of crisis. And when people meet with unexpected events, atypical events, they often turn to conspiracy theories to find good explanations. And this is what we called in our researches the axiomatic anti-Semitism. When there is a financial crisis, for example, or right now there is the refugee crisis, there is a final explanation that can explain that why these bad things happen to otherwise good people, and this is because of the Jews, because of the Jews has some hidden acts, some hidden agenda to achieve their goals. And this is something that is quite frequent. So at the moment, I think on the European far right, the anti-Semitic European far right, this kind of refugee crisis really led to a boost of the conspiracy theories that explain this phenomenon on the basis of Jewish conspiracy. So just to say a few examples from throughout the world. David Duke, the well-known anti-Semite who was politician in the United States beforehand. He believes that ISIS is part of the Jewish supremacist plan, which was made by an Israeli think tank. There are even there are some theories that Israeli nationals were present at Abu Ghraib and encouraged the tortures, what happened there. So even ISIS itself, in some anti-Semitic conspiracy discourses, is a creation of Israel and the Jews. There are even theories that Israel aims to break up Arab states into small pieces which can be conquered later. And where does the Holocaust comes in the picture? There is one theory that is also spreading throughout the web, which is about that there is a plan to bring as lot refugees in Europe as possible by Israel and by Jewish circles, and the idea behind it is that Israel is still so angry about the Holocaust that there is no remorse for Europe, and this is somehow a revenge for the Holocaust. So there are many theories about it. I think almost all of you have heard something. I don't want to quote so many and continue this line, but what I also have to mention, and to be frank, I'm really not happy to mention it here in this event, is that there is a central figure that appears in the anti-Semitic public discourses and who is a central figure of most of the conspiracy theories. He's George Soros. And George Soros is depicted in a lot of cases in the anti-Semitic public discourses as someone who is the real mastermind behind the crisis, with the quite vague goals that I just mentioned beforehand, because I think from a two-step stance, if we think about the interests of the Jews of Europe, I think they can be the most afraid of Islamist radicalization, so I really do not think that this is their vested interest to bring as many refugees in Europe as possible. But what I find a bit problematic is that these discourses over George Soros is the mastermind behind the refugee crisis not only appears in the extremist public discourses. In Hungary, this is something that we can hear in the mainstream public discourses as well. And don't get me wrong, everybody can disagree with George Soros's goals or what he represents as a philanthropist and as an entrepreneur, but depicting him as someone who is the only person who is guiding the overall refugee crisis, and this is something that we unfortunately could hear from the governmental side as well here in Hungary, is something that is first completely wrong. I think you can't explain this very complex phenomenon on a basis of a very simplified conspiracy theory. Second, I don't think that, for example, the Hungarian government said it in order to use open anti-Semitic public discourse. It was not the case, but I think it can be easily understood as anti-Semitic. And for example, an FPÖ politician understood it as anti-Semitism, and that's why he was fired. She was fired from her party. So generally, I think this kind of conspiracy theorizing clearly not help, and I think governments, instead of fueling these conspiracy theories, should rather fight against them with tools of public discourse, political statements, and education.
Thank you.
Jump right in?
Jump right in,
Okay.
Rabbi Baker.
I don't want to talk about the misuse of the word itself. I know this is sort of the general topic here. We all know of examples, whether out of naivete, out of maliciousness, Le Pen saying Holocaust as a detail of history, anti-abortion activists equating that to the Holocaust. Rather, I want to sort of suggest three general areas where politicians, political leaders come into contact not simply with the word, but with the Holocaust as history, the Holocaust as lesson, and where there is a struggle, where political leaders can lead, where they can react, in effect, be positive, be helpful, but also be problematic. The first is, I think, the challenge that has come from the success of the Holocaust in international fora on the part of governments as somehow an essential, universal lesson. There was a time Holocaust was something for Jews, for the Jewish people, for historians. We know over 30 countries in Europe, countries elsewhere around the world, commemorate the Holocaust officially. And now you have essentially this challenge: is the Holocaust the lesson of a particular piece of history, especially a tragedy to the Jewish people, and the lesson that we take from that? Is it a universal lesson or message? Here, I think you can look, say, at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, a remarkable success, but ultimately its success also had to say, we need to make this relevant to the world at large, or to the American population at large. So that isn't to say we're not aware that the Holocaust says something about what anti-Semitism can do, but it maybe suggests that anti-Semitism says something about what hatred of human beings can do. At the outbreak of the first Gulf War, just by way of illustrating, Germany was confronted now, a newly unifying Germany. Was it going to be a participant in this coalition against Saddam Hussein? When the missiles came to Tel Aviv from Iraq, you heard this debate in Germany essentially put very succinctly in this way. Did Auschwitz teach us no more war or no more Auschwitz? In other words, is the pacifist response the appropriate lesson of the Holocaust, or defending the Jewish state at that time the lesson of the Holocaust? I think those are genuine questions that come from this, this tension between the particular and the universal. And of course, we know how it can be carried to a point where we would say it's even being perverted. So you have anti-Israel demonstrators in Amsterdam wearing yellow stars. You have a museum depiction of the Anne Frank apartment, within it now a mosque. In other words, as we've heard, as we say in a working definition of anti-Semitism, the Israeli treatment of Palestinians is essentially what the Nazis did to Jews. But again, it comes out of, I think, a conflict between Holocaust as a particular lesson or as a universal lesson. A second area. There was, we saw 20, 25 years ago, now the opportunity for Eastern Europe, for former communist states, to openly confront this part of their history. I had the occasion in May of 1998 to receive a phone call from Lennart Meri, then the president of Estonia, inviting me to visit him. It was really something the State Department put up to him. He had a particular date in mind. I traveled to Tallinn, and then I accompanied him the next day to Riga, where there was a summit meeting of the 3 Baltic presidents. At that summit meeting, at the end of the meeting, after our conversations during the day, each president announced they were creating an historical commission. This was now going to be the way to look critically at their Holocaust-era history. But they also took that occasion, politically it would not have been possible otherwise, to say historical commissions would also look at the period of the Soviet occupation. And so you had a process begin. It was different in each country. I recall President Meri saying, you know, we have no historians in Estonia today that we can trust. There are no legitimate historians. He turned to Max Jakobsen, a Finnish diplomat, to head up the Estonian Historical Commission. Other countries did it in different ways, but ultimately they did try and come to terms with that history. But others from the outside also said, well, you're looking at the Holocaust, but you're also looking at communism. If this were only, I think, an educational enterprise, one could say those could exist in parallel without a real confrontation. In other words, it's fear. Be open, be clear, be critical on all aspects of history. But there was a sense that the lessons of the Holocaust taught us certain things. Maybe it taught us, well, we need to ban Nazi symbols. We need to make Holocaust denial a legal crime. And there was the challenge somehow, whether it was, did one victimhood somehow take precedence over the others, or with the success of Holocaust commemoration and memory and attention, would it now be possible, should it be, that communism be treated in the same way? I simply recall my earliest visits to this city in the early 90s, going to where there weren't many Western restaurants at the time, visiting a very popular pizzeria. It was called Maxim, I think. And it simply displayed on the placemats, on the walls, all sorts of communist symbols. It's just hard to imagine such a place somewhere in Western Europe with Nazi symbols. But today we have this real debate and argument, should those communist symbols be banned? We have people suggesting, with some legitimacy, that there are efforts to perhaps try to obfuscate the history of the Holocaust and elevate this period of the Soviet occupation and the crimes of the communists. So here we have, again, I think, a dilemma in general that politicians, political leaders must confront. There are those who really, in calling for this focus on elevating the communist tragedy, are creating this double genocide. We know the Genocide Center in Vilnius, Lithuania, a term that legally really doesn't apply, is the term used for what communists did to Lithuanians. So a second area as a challenge for political leaders. And then lastly, a third more general area. Countries themselves have their own particular histories and experiences. In 2003, the time the president of Romania, Jan Iliescu, in an interview with an Israeli newspaper, asked about the Holocaust in Romania, essentially said there was no Holocaust in Romania, or there was, but you know, it was in territory at the time controlled by Hungary. That in turn really kind of forced the government to say, okay, we need to open and at least examine critically what happened in terms of our own history. Various governments may have been quite willing and open, perhaps more in Western Europe, to say, yes, we need to embrace the importance of Holocaust history and memory, but in a more general way. We can all agree January 27th, an appropriate date to commemorate the Holocaust anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. But in fact, in Romania, when they agreed there would be a Holocaust commemoration day, there were many people who felt January 27th is a perfect day. But if you look at the particular history in Romania, those Romanians who died at Auschwitz were deported by Hungarians and Germans. But the internal deportations of Romanians has no relationship to that date. And ultimately, there was an agreement that a date would be found in Romania that related to the history of Romania. In Western European countries, we focused with intensity 2 decades or more ago in dealing with unfinished issues with Holocaust assets. A focus on Swiss banks and what they did. Ironically, focusing on Swiss banks also reopened the history of Switzerland, whose neutrality wasn't quite so neutral during the war. It was only in 1995 that France, that Austria, formally acknowledged their own role in the Holocaust, preferring rather to see themselves as largely a country of resistance fighters, or as someone noted before, not recognizing that, say in the Netherlands, there was the largest percentage of Dutch SS soldiers of any state in Europe that assisted. In fact, when we were fighting on behalf of Nazi victims in Eastern Europe, and one German television channel portrayed what was happening with victims in Eastern Europe not receiving benefits, while here you had Waffen-SS veterans in Latvia, in Ukraine, elsewhere, entitled to pensions. The next day, the producer of the show said the most phone calls they received after their broadcast, which they had hoped would cause the German population to say we have to do more, but the most phone calls came from people in the Netherlands. In fact, they were people saying, well, we're Waffen-SS veterans. How do we apply for these pensions? So countries may be able to express a general commitment to Holocaust commemoration and Holocaust history, but how able and willing are they to really confront their own particular histories? I think that is, again, one additional challenge that we see. I cannot, and I'll end with this, but not recognize, essentially, IHRA came into being because of a very important initiative that was taken by a Swedish prime minister and a Swedish government, and that Stockholm conference in which all of this began. And one of the things heralded, and rightly so, was that book published by the Swedish government, Tell Ye Your Children, a succinct history of the Holocaust, distributed to every household in Sweden. A very important gesture, but if you look at that book, it said almost nothing about the Holocaust in Sweden. So this is not something that we would say it's somehow deniers and advocates, good and bad, black and white, but I think this is also the challenge when we talk about Holocaust in political discourse and the role of political leaders. With that, I'll stop, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cilevics.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Explicit denial of Holocaust is now rare in political discourse and can be noticed only in the language of extreme marginal politicians. However, downplaying Holocaust, distortion, manipulation, or just keeping silent on it increasingly penetrates the agenda of mainstream parties. And this misuse is manifested in different terms. So first, presenting Holocaust as a purely Jewish matter. And paradoxically, this complements, this hijacking Holocaust, what was mentioned today by some speakers, and in particularly by Konstantin Geber. I fully agree with Professor Bauer. Fighting anti-Semitism is important not because Jews are good guys and deserve more care and better protection than other people. It is important because historically anti-Semitism is the most extreme and salient example of how prejudice and intolerance may evolve to systemic harassment and discrimination and ultimately result in organized extermination of millions of people, including women and children, simply on the basis of their religious or ethnic identity. Therefore, remembering Holocaust is important not only for Jews, but also and rather for all people, regardless of their origin or belief. Second, the Holocaust issue is closed. All the problems have been solved, Jews are securely protected, perpetrators condemned and punished, and the problem is not worth mentioning anymore. This is the points quite often made in political discourse. Needless to say, this is far from being true. Anti-Semitic incidents and violent attacks on Jews occur in many places in Europe, but not surprisingly, the point mentioned above is often made in the context of debates on restitution of Jewish property lost during the Holocaust. Third, trivialization of Holocaust is oftentimes accompanied with references to selfish interest of Jewish organizations. I'm not going to comment on this point. And fourth, very often and increasingly often, I would say, various forms of misuse of Holocaust are related to PR war over the Middle East conflict. Also today, we saw several evidences of allegations that the genuine Holocaust is perpetrated by Israel against Palestinians. And here again, I cannot agree more with what Professor Bauer said. anti-Semitic incidents play extremely destructive role with regard to attempts to bring peace to the Middle East. Needless to say, the state of Israel cannot and should not be immune from criticism simply because it is a Jewish state. But when this criticism is not based on genuine human rights concerns, but clearly fueled by anti-Semitic prejudice and borders with Holocaust denial, it is highly detrimental to the genuine peace-building efforts in the region and ultimately harms Palestinians rather than Jews. And last but not least, mentioning Holocaust is sometimes avoided in order not to play into hands of hostile propaganda, blaming some Central and East European states for alleged collaboration with Nazis. And Rabbi Baker mentioned this problem too. Blame is often put on Jews, as if because of them, some states become politically vulnerable. Moreover, Jews are often blamed for the crimes of the communist regimes, despite in most countries of the region exactly the Jewish minority suffered the most, also from communist oppression and organized state-led anti-Semitic campaigns. So while the number of anti-Semites and xenophobes in our societies, in fact, is not significant, too many political leaders and opinion makers do not raise their voices against manifestations of anti-Semitism, including trivialization and downplaying of Holocaust. Therefore, not only outbreaks of intolerance, but rather tolerance to intolerance demonstrated by political class gives rise to serious concerns. Growing number of political parties which in a more or less explicit form manifest sympathy towards anti-Semitic ideas is dangerous indeed. Moreover, representation in parliaments and municipalities and real political influence of these parties is growing too. I agree with those speakers today who express some skepticism about criminal prosecution. In my view, it is essential to establish reliable safeguards and prevent the situations when explicitly xenophobic parties come in power through formally democratic procedures, as was the case with German Nazis in 1933. Formally correct voting procedures are not enough to entrench genuine democracy. The substance of the ideas offered to voters does matter too. The parties that do not accept such basic values as equality of all people, regardless of belief, ethnic origin, mother tongue, gender, or sexual identity, should be disqualified from political competition. Of course, the procedures for such exclusion must be transparent and based on objective criteria, and setting up such procedures requires close cooperation between the parliaments, international bodies, and human rights lawyers. And to conclude, just one example. I believe that those parties whose agenda is seriously marked by anti-Semitism or other type of racism, xenophobia, and intolerance should not have the right to participate in the international parliamentary assemblies. More than 2 years ago, I was among those members of the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly who signed a motion aiming at introducing the possibility not to ratify credentials of those members of national delegations who represent xenophobic and anti-Semitic parties. So far, the efforts to introduce such provisions produced limited results. And I believe that enhanced international cooperation with this regard is of crucial importance. Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm going to stand because I'm American and I watched Steve Jobs a lot. I think we all touched upon similar things, and maybe I'll try to summarize and ask a question of all of you before turning it over to the audience. I think we've established that misuse of the Holocaust can not necessarily be linked, but can on occasion be linked to anti-Semitism. You can also link it to a certain political cynicism or callousness. So I see heads nodding, so we won't go further down that road. But the one thing each of you also touched upon is what we could call a post-communist condition that helps inform a particular form of Holocaust use and misuse. And I think it differs across each national states, sometimes within national states or boundaries, in former Warsaw Pact countries and former Soviet countries. Let's go a little beyond IHRA with this question. We've just witnessed, and still are witnessing to a certain extent, the employment of Holocaust imagery during the conflict over eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. You have the Russian Federation on the one hand employing Holocaust imagery to impugn the post-Maidan government of Ukraine. You have Ukrainians doing the same to a certain extent. And it's led to this weird overlapping narrative of victimhood that bears out over generations. Is the phenomenon of utilization of the Holocaust something that we can continue to expect in former Warsaw Pact and former Soviet countries, or will it reach a point where Holocaust discourse will become in line with that of countries that were on the other side of the Iron Curtain? And as part of that question, is that necessarily a good thing? So maybe I'll just I see you, Rabbi Baker starting.
As the non-Eastern European here, I'll jump in, right? I don't know. First of all, I think one thing we saw when you talk about former Warsaw Pact countries, but if we talk about essentially Central Eastern European countries that are now members of NATO, members of the EU, there was a kind of forced process to confront this period in history. It was really part of the price of joining NATO, of ultimately joining these umbrellas. It was both good and bad, because it forced efforts that probably wouldn't have happened naturally for a much longer time. But then, having forced it, how deep were they in terms of coming to terms with that history? As I said, if it took France decades before it could recognize its own role, and it was an open democratic society from the end of the war, then how much could we really expect, whether it was Poland or Lithuania, Romania, where you can only go back to 1991. So we saw remarkable progress, but how deep it was is another question, and that there is sort of backsliding maybe shouldn't come as a surprise. When you start talking about Russia and Ukraine, they didn't even have this process. So here you have a situation, again, it's a different one in each place, but Ukraine, where 1.5 million or more Nazi victims are buried, and they're not, they weren't victims from mechanized camps. These are mass graves. People, almost every case local people, very much a part of it, marched their neighbors out and saw them being shot and helped them be buried and took their belongings. And they've yet to really come to terms with that history. And in Russia, memorials in the Soviet Union to Nazi victims say nothing about the Holocaust. They say nothing about Jews. They say these were Soviet citizens murdered by German fascists. So the particularity of being Jews and of suffering in the Holocaust is also something that is still to really come to full term. And then, as you say, there is a kind of irony here that the Holocaust itself becomes a kind of football now in this battle between those two countries.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So nationalists in Central and Eastern Europe will always feel very much uncomfortable about the Holocaust, because they used to present themselves as a victim. And it's very difficult to recognize that there were people who suffered as much or maybe even more and who enjoy more in international attention. And so this irritates nationalists. And so these reactions is something we cannot get rid of. As to Russia and Ukraine, yes, indeed, Holocaust is just, I would say, cynically used as a very strong emotional weapon. And in Russia, it's also, this is what I was thinking about when listening to the previous panel, that we now live in the world where this debate on Facebook or Twitter or whatever is not necessarily a sincere discussion, a clash of different views. But increasingly often this is a well-organized information war where you have very good chances and increasingly big chances to face a specially prepared, trained and equipped troll. And you never know whether you are engaging in sincere debate or you just fell victim of information war. And on the Russian side, it's really a very efficient part of this information war. Mm-hmm. As to Ukrainian side, it's I would say even more tragic history, because Ukraine today is too institutionally weak to effectively fight this really racist and anti-Semitic elements which are present in today's Ukrainian political landscape. It's not mainstream, but they are present, and democratic forces in Ukrainian leadership are simply too weak to effectively fight them. So they try to do something, but in our view, the most smart behavior on the part of international community in this debate is to keep an eye on what is going on, but not to fall victims of these provocations and manipulations, and not to take sides in these debates. We have to rely on our own conclusions, but not to trust any of the sides in this debate, and we have to realize that, of course, this is a sort of an instinct. When we hear the word Holocaust, we have to intervene, we have to jump in. Not necessarily, not always, and this situation, Russia against Ukraine, is probably exactly the case when we should think twice before we get engaged or say something.
Yeah, I would like to pick up on 2 points. First, is there a specific post-communist type of dealing with the Holocaust? I think it's a very important question. I think there is, in the sense that the communist regimes made it quite easy for post-World War II Eastern European societies to draw a very strong division line between the past and the present. So it was the post-capitalist fascist regimes that did this horror, and it has nothing to do with the society itself. It is just because of the ideology and because of the regime. So with the Marxist explanation. And I think it made it quite easy for all the states in this region to claim that we ourselves did not have any responsibility in this process because it was just the Germans and it was just the Nazis. So I think this heritage keeps living on. On the other hand, I do think that no country in the world likes to face its deepest, darkest parts of history. So I think it is pretty universal in the sense as well that as every person likes to rather forget his or her sins, every nation likes to forget their sins. As for the use of Holocaust imaginary in political discourse, especially in foreign relations and during crisis, yes, I think it's a phenomenon. It doesn't not just exists in Eastern Europe. Regarding the Middle East crisis, we can hear it practically every day. And yeah, I do think it's a problem. It clearly doesn't help. It first leads to the inflation of this word and what it expresses, and it will keep living in this way because I think the Holocaust is the most extreme form of evil as it exists in, let's say, at least the European or at least a Western type of thinking. So I think it's a strong word and it will be always used. In the particular case of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, I find it quite interesting, on the other hand, that while Russia keep blaming the Ukrainian government of being just a Nazi fascist banderist junta, and the Russian diplomacy writes long pieces about that, how big danger is it in Europe that far-right forces are on the rise. The same country, the same regime supports far-right forces throughout Europe, financially, diplomatically, politically, and on the other hand, they use these players to legitimize elections in Russia and Eastern Ukraine. So I think Russia has the best network of European far-right players, including Holocaust deniers, anti-Semites and neo-Nazis. On the other hand, they keep calling for fighting against anti-Semitism. I find it a bit contradictory.
Yeah. The reason I have the Ukrainian-Russian conflict foremost in mind is, and I agree with the assertion that Russia's influence on far-right parties throughout the continent is something to confront. But there's been a particular response in Ukraine, a country that is actually beginning to wrestle with this past in small ways. There are major plans underway for the anniversary at Babi Yar for this year, for example. But at the same time, they've begun to legislate against denial of certain sins from the past, but also to remove references to the Soviet past simultaneously. And it's caused this odd situation within the country. The Rada passed a law making it almost criminal, not quite criminal, but almost criminal, to impugn the memory of heroes of the past, including OUN and Stepan Bandera and individuals who, there's a vigorous academic debate about their complicity in the Holocaust. So we've been talking about ways to address misuse of the Holocaust in various discursive forums, and maybe I'm going to put this to the audience because we only have 2 minutes. Is regulation the answer, or should we seek, remember I'm American, should we seek a discursive society where we discuss these issues and the extremes become marginalized? I saw one hand, and that'll be our one.
As an American, you only ask it rhetorically.
Yes.
It's not exactly a question for you. Perhaps somebody else.
Can you hold for the microphone, please?
I have a question, I presume, especially for Peter Kreko, but also combining it with the question to Andras Heisler, who I think is not here anymore. Okay, my question and comment is this. To make one step back to the Netherlands, there the major, the Jewish major of Amsterdam, Job Cohen, he was, during his being major, he was accused of bringing the Muslims in, yes? So there was a kind of allyship between Muslims and the Jew, so to say. This is an old Christian motive, Jews and Muslims together against Christianity. Now I heard two very different but paradoxical facts about Hungary. One was, if I understood well, that the extreme right, the right politician said no to the immigrants because we have the largest Jewish community, and there will be, the danger is big for terrorist attacks, and he's an anti-Semite. I have understood it. Then this is my final, the final point. You said that there are rumors, and I'm very interested in your sources, there are rumors that in fact Israel or the Jews are behind this refugee crisis to take revenge. How to combine this all?
If you could answer in 30 seconds and maybe save it for the hallway.
Yes,
we are up against the clock,
first,
I'm afraid.
as for the first statement, I think in Hungary it's rather the government's statement, if I'm not mistaken, that that the Jewish communities in Hungary are in danger as a consequence of the refugee crisis. The Hungarian far right is not so much afraid of what will happen with the Jews in Hungary. It's not their main concern, to say the least. Second, as for, yes, there are a lot of conspiracy theories about the Jews are behind the refugee crisis, but we can say that this is not unique in the sense that we can find such conspiracy theories about all kinds of crisis. I'm just saying that this is becoming more and more mainstream in not just in Hungary, I think in overall Europe. There are two main kinds of conspiracy theories. One is that it was ISIS. The refugees themselves are the Trojan horse for ISIS. There are the ones that are rather blaming the Jews, and there are the combination of two. So we can find a wide variety of conspiracy theories, and I think they will remain here. So I think it's something to deal with.
Thank you. I see Professor Bauer asked to have a question posed before we conclude. Yes, small comment and microphone. Oh, two microphones.
Thank you. I think I'm missing something here. I thought we were discussing political discourse and use and misuse of the Holocaust. The Holocaust created a tremendous trauma globally, but especially in Europe. And every country and many politicians are misusing the Holocaust for political purposes. There's a general trend. Mm-hmm. I mean, in my own country, just a few days ago, Netanyahu made a comment which is this absolutely scandalous misuse of the Holocaust. You have similar things all over the place. Usually they are accusing the others of being responsible for the Holocaust in their country. Or else the other way around, as for instance under the communists in Poland, but also afterwards, when every Pole was really a rescue of the Jews. Okay? It took some contemporary Polish historians like Grabowski and Leosiak and Engelking and others to begin to explode that story. You had the same story in places like Denmark, the Netherlands, and other countries. We were okay, really, yeah? We opposed the Nazis. Nonsense. So this is, where does it come from? It comes from the fact that the Holocaust was German directed and initiated and motivated, but it was a European project. Everybody participated. With, you know, opposition, yeah. Rescuers. Yeah, they were rescuers. They were tremendously courageous people. A tiny minority. Tiny, tiny, tiny minority in the major countries where this took place. The same applies to the United States. The same applies to other countries. Mm-hmm. Now, how do you fight that? Nobody seems to have had an answer here. The obvious thing is, like with any trauma, you know, there's a 101 course in psychology. You let the patient face the trauma, face the reality that's behind the trauma. And this is what IHRA is trying to do. It'll take a very long time to do that, but there's no other way. You have to tell people what actually happened, which is not nice to hear at all.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bauer. And with that, I've gotten several flags that we need to move on to the next session. Wow, this mic is very hot. There we go.
I actually think that, as usual, Professor Bauer both summed up greatly what we have heard so far, as well as pointed out markers for further investigation and pursuing. This has been, I think, an extraordinarily interesting conference. I would like to thank the participants and the panelists, all the panels from this morning and this afternoon, as well as the moderators, as well as those of you who have stayed with us all day, those of you who have communicated to us electronically and participated in that way. And I think that really we have begun a conversation and an exploration that is in many ways long overdue. As you heard, confronting the trauma of the past is elementary but essential, and yet at the same time it is almost at a crisis point given the eruptions that Europe and the West are facing today, and the breaks and ruptures in civil society and otherwise that we are dealing with. Certainly, primarily in many ways, among them, the rise of anti-Semitism, violent anti-Semitism, the issue, as we referred to earlier, of the migrant crisis, the refugee crisis, and how we deal with these things going forward is going to require the efforts and energies of not just the participants in the room, but all of our societies. But nonetheless, what we have done here and tried to do here, I think, is begin an exploration and exploring some of the themes, the dominant themes, with a diverse and expert group of panelists ranging across the entire IHRA region, which includes all of Europe, as well as representation from North America. IHRA does include South American members as well, Israel, of course, as well as from other European organizations and communities. And I think that this beginning needs to continue, as was pointed out many times already, in a practical, not just intellectual vein. So having said that, I think we now know a little bit more of what we're dealing with, but also a lot more of what we have to do going forward in the future. Thank you for your attendance and participation. Thank you, Chair, I didn't see you here, for coming back, returning to us, supporting this conference, and I wish you well to the next time that we meet, and hopefully in better circumstances. Thank you. Have a good evening.